whenever I hear my bio, I think, wow, I feel like that's like a person that's 100 years old. So I actually started when I was 2. No, I'd like to just say, again, I'm Pamela Randall Garner, and I am so thankful to Gilda and to the Community Consolidated District 93 for inviting me into the Glen Bar Parent Series specifically. So thank you so much for being here and for inviting me to be here. I'm excited to tell you about CASEL and about the restorative practices work that's going on not only here in Chicago area, but really around the country and around the world. So before we get started, I just want to, let me advance. And if I stand in the way of the screen, tell me to get out of the way. I just want to get a feel of where are we in terms of your knowledge around restorative practices. I'm going to abbreviate it and say RP for most of the presentation. RP for restorative practices, RJ for restorative justice. So you'll understand what I mean when I'm talking about RP, RJ. Another acronym that I'm going to use quite a bit is SCL, which stands for social and emotional learning. So now that we have the acronyms kind of on the table, RP, restorative practices, RJ for restorative justice, and SCL, social and emotional learning. How many of you have already taken or you're doing RP in your class or in your school or in your home? Raise your hand if you're kind of dabbling in it, okay. And how many of you, this is your first introduction to RP or RJ? Raise your hands high, don't be shy. It's okay, we were all there at one point. Okay, so we have a mixture. Well, let me say right off the bat, we're going to be here for about an hour and a half to 2 hours is what I understand. Is that correct, Gilda? Okay. So there's so much to learn about RP and RJ that I am only going to provide you with a high-level overview because it is very deep work. It's a lot of information to share, and I really can't do it in an hour and a half and 2 hours. But the good news is that I have provided for you, and I hope everyone picked up one of the handouts. This is my go-to resource from the International Institute of Restorative Practices. I think it is the go-to organization, like CASEL is the go-to organization around SEL. For me, IIRP is the go-to place, which is in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, around restorative practices. They have provided, I think, an even better overview and a little more in-depth than what we're going to get into today. So please make sure you read this at your leisure. If you have that, I don't have that, but if you have that, make sure you read through this. I think it does a really good job of capsulizing, of capturing the deeper understanding around the restorative framework. So please use that as a resource. In addition to the resource that I provided you, these are mine, so I don't have copies for you, but I'm going to pass these around just so that you can start leafing through. These books, starting with this first one, the Restorative Practices Handbook, if you really want to go deeper than what we're going to do today, I strongly suggest that you purchase this book. I am not selling it, CASEL is not selling it, but it's a great go-to handbook on getting restorative practices started in your school or in your home or in your community. And then we're going to talk a little bit about circles. So the green book, again, more in depth around circles. I'm going to pass these around, and I just hope to get them back at the end. You can just bring them back up. The Restorative Justice Handbook, it's a little bit thicker. It gets more into what happens when there's restorative justice needs. An infraction has happened in your school, there's been some type of incident, and it can go from an informal conferencing with that student or with that offender to a formal conference that's sanctioned by courts and the justice system. So this book for restorative justice. And then there's a very helpful handbook on family engagement and family power. So I'm going to pass that around as well. So we'll start that over here. Now, just to jump in, what I'd like to do, and I'm glad that you're in circles because this is what we do at CASEL. When we start a lot of our presentations, we like to start trying to build community right away. And it could be a very simple question as easy as, tell me your name, what do you do, like if you're at a school, if I'm a parent, and then we kind of do what we call a softball question. Where's your favorite place to vacation? So we're going to demonstrate this with this group here, if that's okay. So at your tables, I'm going to ask that you're going to help me model this, correct? Okay, is that all right? So I'm Pamela Randall Garner. I am the Senior Staff Advisor at Castle, and my favorite place to vacation is in Carmel, Monterey, California. Doug.
I'm Doug Pettit. I'm a parent. My favorite place to vacation is Washington, D.C.
I'm Becky Gabrenia. I'm an assistant principal from Marquardt Middle School. We have the middle school over there, just down the road. My favorite place to vacation, if I had time for one, probably Florida.
Okay, thank you, Doug and Becky, for demonstrating. So we're going to do this right away. And this is a practice that we encourage teachers to do in the classroom just to start to build community. You will hear throughout this presentation that building community is one of the main objectives, one of the main goals of restorative practices, of establishing that restorative practice environment. Something as simple as introductions, you start hearing commonalities, you start hearing things that, oh, I'm curious about vacationing in Washington, D.C. Or I'm really curious about you like to whitewater raft in Colorado. So that very simple, very inexpensive practice is one of the first suggestions or recommendations I would make for you as you're starting to build your restorative environment in your school or in your home or in your community. So we're going to get to shared agreements in a minute, but if I'd like to ask if this group, whenever you see me raise my hand, that if we could agree that that will be our signal to bring your sentence to a close and then direct your attention back up to me. So do we have agreement for that, that when you see this happen, that don't cut off, but just draw your comments to a close and then direct your attention back up to me, please. And I see heads nodding, so I'm going to assume that we're all in agreement with that. I'm going to ask that you do this circle activity just for the next 10, 15 seconds, enough to go around the table, do the exact thing that you just saw Doug and Becky and me do, and we're going to take 10 to 15 seconds or however long it takes for you to get around. I think we have about 7 at a table. All right, so if you could start, you all decide where you're going to start, and we'll get started on the other end.
Favorite place that I'd like to go to more would be in Europe. Happy Market Guidance Counselor inside middle school. And I have a lot of places I've been and like to go to, but I guess if I had to choose one, I would say someplace I haven't been yet.
Uh-oh.
I've been to one of the other.
Let's see, I was in Chicago Public Schools for a long time, St. Louis, Houston. I've been in Chicago.
But you don't train for the IRP, do you?
No, well, not officially yet, but mainly For Castle. Yeah.
District 93 is partnered with CASA for our SEL committee.
Oh, perfect. Is Ruth Cross your?
Yeah, she's our person.
Okay. She is my go-to person for every.
I'm 89.
Okay. Yeah. So that's what the affiliation is. Yeah. So did everyone get a chance to go or no? Do we still have some introductions that need to happen? Okay. And just so I know that you've seen me, if you could also raise your hand. I forgot to put that part in there because I was thinking no one's raising their hand. So when you see me, if you could raise your hand too, that lets me know that you've seen me raise my hand. So how did that feel? Just, you can popcorn this out. How did it feel to talk about yourself and to... Don't be shy. This is going to be interactive. I see some heads. What was that about? So, talked about some commonalities. I heard someone back here say, "Oh, you went to that school. I went to that school too." So yeah, it starts to hopefully to develop and to build that community in your school. One of the major foundational points of restorative practice is building that community, not only with students but with adults as well. So hopefully that felt good for you. All right, and again, another practice that we really promote and advocate in the classroom or even at home in the community is that you have shared agreements and you enlist the support and the ideas of the students or the children in your home or in your school. This does a couple of things. First of all, it's not the teacher or the principal or the parent saying, here are the rules that you will abide by. Here's what you're going to be held accountable for. It helps to bring in student voice around what are we going to do in this place that's going to make learning at its peak. It's going to be the most supportive learning environment for me as a student to learn or for me as a child to coexist in this family. So we're going to, again, demonstrate some shared agreements. And I asked you at the very start of this presentation, are you okay with me making one of the shared agreements that when I raise my hand as the presenter, you're going to bring your conversation to a close, you're going to raise your hand, and we're going to agree that that's going to be our signal. What are some other agreements that we need to have within this room that's going to make learning most beneficial for you? So just, again, popcorn them out. Popcorn them out means just yell them out. Yes, ma'am.
No talking when somebody else is talking. Pay attention.
I think that's wonderful. No sidebar conversations, no additional noise so that it's distracting. Now, if I'm in front of my classroom or if I'm a parent at home, ideally I would have a poster and I would be listing these out so that they would be a constant reminder of these are the agreements that we came up with. It's not me determining it, but we would start listing them. So no sidebar conversations. What's another, yes sir, Doug.
Turn off your smartphone.
Okay, so technology. I know you all are very busy. You've got to pay attention. Maybe you have a sick parent or a child or you're an administrator and the school's on fire or something. I understand that you have to check your technology, but let's try to reduce the use of technology in this hour and a half, 2 hours. Okay, so that would be the next thing I would list. What are some other agreements that we can all agree to? And I'm going to take you through that full agreement exercise in a minute. What else do we need? Yes, ma'am.
Possibly like us agreeing when to take a break and how long we will be at this.
Right, so in this case, because we're only here for a short time, we're not going to take a break, but if I was going to do a full day presentation, a workshop, of course I would say, you know what, we need to take 2 or 3 breaks throughout this day. So agreeing that we're going to have break time, that's going to be a brain break time as well. Is that what you were going to do? Okay, so the third thing would be making sure that we're taking appropriate time for our brains to regroup and for us to do bio breaks and the like. What other agreements would you like to see on this imaginary list that I have here? You just took the words right out of my head. assuming positive intent, being respectful of opinions that you may not agree with, but just understanding that it's probably coming from a positive intent and we're going to respect each other's viewpoints or perspectives. It's really important, especially in a classroom, well, in any situation, but thank you for that. Let's take one more. And I was a teacher, so I will wait. Do we have one more? Yes, ma'am.
Maybe I know when I've done this before, listening with your full body, really looking at the person who's speaking and trying to hear them.
I love that, your full body. And it's something that it's not in this presentation, but we talk a lot about active listening, so that you're tracking the person who is speaking, you're nodding when it's appropriate. If you're sitting down, you're actually sitting and focused like knee to knee. We kind of say knee to knee, chest to chest, kind of attentive listening or active listening. So we will be present and active and demonstrating active listening. That's great. All right, so we just listed about 5 or 6 shared agreements that we would say, this is what we need to have happen in the classroom if we're going to be the best students or the best children or the best adults in this environment. So one way to check to see if there are any questions is that we do something called fist to 5. If you agree completely with the agreements that we just came up with, you're going to put up a 5. If you're kind of like, I agree to 2 of those, but the other 3, I want some more discussion, you might put up a 3. And if you decide, you know what, I don't like anything of what these folks just talked about, you're going to put up a fist. So that's going to give me, as the adult, as the teacher or the principal or the parent, some idea of, oh, we have full agreement, or we still have some discussion that needs to happen. Again, this is a restorative practice to start building that community to make sure students understand that their voice is just as important as the voice of the adults in the school or the adults in the community center or the adults at home. So can we practice that? If you're in agreement of those 5 or 6 imaginary poster agreements, you're going to put up a 5 or some number below. And I have to see all hands because I know that okay, I see all hands up. And what this does for me as the teacher, it lets me know that if I see Gilda having a sidebar conversation, I can just say, oh, Gilda, you remember when we all agreed to number 1 or number 2? And we just go right back to that. And so that holds Gilda accountable. It's not Pamela saying, Gilda, stop that talking. It's all of us saying, these are the agreements that we agreed to and we all voted on. And so we've got to be held to those. And you'll find that students start kind of checking each other. It's not always the teacher that's having to say, Gilda or Pamela, stop talking. All right, so that's another practice that you will learn and hear more about in restorative practices. Here are the objectives. I'm just looking at the time, so I want to kind of zoom through these a little bit. Here are the objectives for me as a presenter. I hope that by the end of this presentation, you will have a clearer understanding of restorative practices, of the difference between RP and RJ, restorative justice, that you'll understand the various contexts in which we use RP and RJ. You'll know a little bit about the history of restorative practices. Can you hear me okay? Is that okay? And you'll also learn more about the supporting framework, which is mainly in this handout. I'm not going to have time to go into great detail, but you have it there. You're also going to be reminded about social and emotional learning. I understand through Gilda that you've had some training in SEL. That's great. We're going to touch on that just a tiny bit so that you can see the alignment between SEL and RP. And then you're going to get a chance, as you've already done, to practice some of these RP activities. Now, can I get a volunteer to read the Castle definition of social and emotional learning? Yes, ma'am.
SEL involves processes through which children and adults develop fundamental emotional and social competencies to understand and manage emotions, set and achieve positive goals, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain positive relationships, and make responsible decisions.
Okay. So we're talking about 5 competencies, and you'll see a little bit more as we go further into the deck, but the 5 competencies, the Castle competencies on what we mean by social and emotional learning. Any questions or discussions around this definition? Does this look familiar to you? Have some of you seen this before? I see some heads nodding. Okay. That's what CASEL means in terms of SEL. Now, restorative practice, can I get another volunteer, please, to read that definition? Yes, ma'am.
A social science that studies how to build social capital and achieve social discipline through participatory learning and decision-making.
Right. So it's something that happens to build community, to build social capital. And that's the definition that IIRP uses, okay? So again, it's a science, just like SEL is a science. There's research that you can review, that you can provide to substantiate or justify your reasoning for bringing in restorative practices as a viable alternative to suspensions, as a viable alternative to pushing students out, which is, of course, what we're hoping to reduce. And restorative practices is something that happens before a wrongdoing. I think a lot of times people think they get the term restorative practice and restorative justice mixed up, quite frankly. I was actually doing that before I went to IIRP and learned the difference. Restorative practices are the structures and systems that we put in place before the wrongdoing or before an infraction happens, so that we have already built a community where those infractions are minimized. The likelihood of students acting out in a class are minimized because we've done the proactive work. We focused on building a community in our homes and in our schools, so that kind of behavior just doesn't even come up. And so it's the work that we do on the front end. It's the proactive approach to make sure that we're building that community so students are less likely, or adults are less likely to have infractions or incidents or to prevent conflict from happening. And this is what it does. It builds the social capital. So you're having more connections with the students, student to student, student to teacher. There's more of a sense of trust and community building in the classroom. There's a greater need or understanding that happens from student to student or student to teacher. There's a more cooperative approach to whatever potential conflict that comes up. The focus is on let's reduce the conflict so that we have more time for learning. So that's what you're hoping to build, and that's the social capital that we are hoping will happen. Now, restorative justice, again, is a subset of restorative practices. When an infraction happens or when there's an incident that causes some harm, then we're going to look at restorative practices, and that can be something as simple as an informal conference. It could be a student saying on the playground, we're going to stop. You just you took that rope from Jane, and we're going to stop because that's not what we do here. Let's have a little conference of how we can maybe share the jump rope or share the ball. Something as informal as that would be considered a restorative justice approach to kind of minimize the conflict, all the way to a legal action where there's, the legal system is involved, and in some cases, students have been given the option to have a formal restorative justice conference to repair the harm as opposed to going to, some type of incarceration. So that's the full spectrum, and again, you'll learn more about that spectrum as we get deeper into the deck and into the handout that you have. Any questions so far as we go through these definitions of SEL, restorative practices, and restorative justice? And please stop me at any point. You don't have to wait for my question, inquiry about questions. You can stop me at any point, please. So the social discipline, we know there's this research that shows that when you have restorative practice structures in your organization, in your school, or in your home, there's a reduction in crime, there's a reduction in bullying and violence. The behavior that you're seeing demonstrated both adult to student and student to student is improved. It builds a stronger society. That's a no-brainer. We know that when there's less conflict, there's going to be greater harmony. So it's building the community and the society in your area. And it also provides a stronger example or demonstration of leadership. I know many principals that they do, and even board members, quite frankly, when I went to IIRP, there were board members, when I went to training, board members that are now doing their board meetings in a circle. Can you imagine? I mean, I was an interim superintendent in St. Louis, and let me tell you, I've been in some board meetings where that just the concept of having us be in a circle and to hear everyone's voice in a civil manner it was unheard of, especially during that time when I was there. So it really provides a model for leadership, not just for the students. It restores relationships and it repairs harm. And it's happening in greater context than just education. I was on Mayor Emanuel's commission for a Safer Chicago. I guess you probably say, well, we're not doing a really good job, but he had a commission of thought leaders and educators and SEL leaders around the city to come together on a regular basis. And one of the meetings that we attended, he got in front of the commission and said, listen, we've got to start doing more restorative practices in city government. It's not just for the schools or for the community organizations. In city government, we need to demonstrate this. And he talked about, and the new superintendent, Johnson, was there saying, we're going so far as to bring gang leaders to a circle table and sitting down with them and saying, listen, this obviously is not working, and we've got to do something differently. And we want to hear from you, gang leaders and neighborhood leaders and activists, us all sitting at the table equally and with full voice voices being heard. So he's even doing it at the city level. So we're seeing it at criminal justice and social workers, counselors, not just educators, but around big business as well and organizations, business organizations. The history. Now this started in this country back in the 70s. There was a situation where I believe he was a parole officer. He had, juvenile justice officer, agent, had a couple of students that had vandalized someone's property. And he came up with this idea of, instead of punishing you or sending you off to juvenile detention, I'm going to bring you to, before the person where you vandalized the property. And we're going to sit down and we're going to talk about, what do you need to do? Are you going to clean it up? Are you going to work to repair the damage that was done? That was one of the first conversations around the offender-victim conversations. And that started back in the 70s. So this has actually been around for quite a while. About the same time that was happening, a similar situation was happening in Canada. So around the 70s, within this country, that's where restorative practices really, really took off. But the reality is, if you know your history, we know that there are indigenous societies, the First Nations people, what we call Native Americans, but when I was just up in Canada, they said, we don't say Native Americans, we say First Nations, because these were the people who were here in this nation first before it was even America. So I started using that term, First Nations people, and African cultures, and Asian cultures. You'll see these same kinds of restorative practices happening in the indigenous cultures centuries ago. But more recently, in our countries, in North America, it happened back in the 70s, around the same time that it was happening in Canada as well. So 80s, starting in the 70s, but becoming worldwide throughout the 80s and 1980s and 90s. Okay, so with that said, I'm going to take, and hopefully I'm going to be able to do this technologically well. We're going to see, it's a 15-minute video, so I just want you to kind of get in your head how long the video is going to last. But I think it's a great introduction of the gamut of restorative practices. And then on the other side, we're going to start practicing, and I'm going to reinforce a lot of what you're going to see in the video. So help me here let me see if I can remember what Ryan told me to do. Let me know if the sound is okay, please.
Restorative practices has really changed the school.
Can you hear it?
Here
Well, what I like about circles is like everybody gets a turn.
We need to talk to our kids. We need to create these relationships.
It's all about building relationships. They're able to believe in their own feelings and to share their own feelings.
You get to say everything you want to say, and people listen to you.
It truly is something that's allowing our students to believe that they feel safe and to believe that they feel cared about within our community.
It made me feel like a part of this class. It made me feel special.
I think it's really transformed our school. We're working towards building the kind of school that we want.
Restorative practices are based on principles that emphasize the importance of positive relationships as central to building community and involve processes that restore relationships when harm has occurred. A restorative school environment is about building relationships, giving students a voice, creating an inclusive community, working with students, and consistency in the restorative process.
It's all about building relationships and stressing the importance of that, to know that if I just spend time building relationships with my students, that's going to allow for a climate in the classroom that will really foster their learning.
Before we can get to testing, before we can get to academics, we have to start with how do we connect to and how do we relate to this human being that is in front of us. Restorative Practices has been able to give people language around taking all of those different things on. The number one thing for me being the relationships that people have with one another.
Human beings are happier, more productive, and more likely to make positive changes in their behavior when those in positions of authority do things with them rather than to them or for them.
We often, as adults, we talk down to the kid. It can be something as simple as you threw that pen at him, I need you to come in at lunch, I need you to serve his attention.
In a lot of areas in their lives, they don't feel like they get to be heard, they're talked to.
Letting the kid talk. I think that's the biggest thing.
A lot of adults that only let you say what they want to hear.
The key to the whole system, restorative practice to me, is trust. They have to trust that you're going to allow them to speak.
Someone's actually listening to what I have to say, why I'm hurting. They're listening and they're not judging me. It's a great feeling to allow everybody's stories to be a part of the community. And we're building that framework.
It really just builds community and it just creates a model for how we all want to relate to one another.
Ultimately, everyone wants to feel a sense of belonging. They want to be seen. They want to connect with another person.
Children who are assailants are often victims themselves who haven't been taught that they really are part of something. They don't feel like they're part of something, and they don't feel that they have a voice.
No matter who you are here at Civic Center, just in the community, we work really hard to instill community and to help people feel like there's a place where they're wanted, where they feel comfortable, they feel good about coming to school every day.
When I first came into school, I think that I felt like a fish out of water, but when I started participating more, I got to see how everybody interacts and everyone was just about it.
What I really like about the restorative practices is that you're working with the students to help them to develop their own problem-solving skills.
You have to make this sort of leap of faith that it's going to work out and give them full buy-in to the culture of the school. It really makes sense because they're the ones who have to go to school here.
They work it out. You tell me what you think you should do. Make that person feel that they come up with some things that are phenomenal.
It's always going to be the same process. For the adults, we have a tool that gives us the words to say and a process to go through for every single case. Kids who have a lot of trauma in their lives, this is the same process every day with every adult. And no matter what happens, they are being heard.
Using these questions, and not everyone has them memorized yet, but even when they take out the card, it's giving them a chance to pause before reacting.
It's giving the adult a chance to pause before reacting and the child a chance to pause, and so it sort of slows down that process of reactivity.
The continuum of restorative practices includes effective statements, restorative dialogue and impromptu conferences, circles, community building and repairing harm, and formal competency. Effective statements are statements that include how a person was affected by the behavior of another person.
Teachers are really trained now in like using effective statements. So as opposed to saying stop talking, it's you're frustrating me right now because I'm trying to talk to the class and we keep talking. It'd be helpful if you stopped.
You're going to come in quietly and have a seat and you're going to give me your dictation. Watch how Kiva does it. So be the boy. I love how the class is giving them plenty of thinking time. A variety of sports. I like it. Everybody's thinking for themselves, their own ideas. Sorry. I like how he knows he shouldn't be playing in his folder right now.
I can use an affective statement and I can say, I really care about you right now and I'm concerned about the fact that you haven't been to school for 3 days. Is everything okay with you and your family right now? Because last week you were here every day and I know that your mom has been sick.
When responding to a conflict, a restorative approach consists of asking key questions.
We usually follow those specific questions. It's more or less what happened, what were you thinking, what are you thinking about now, who have you harmed, how can we resolve it?
Instead of saying, why did you do that? Asking what happened. Creating a deeper understanding of the importance of letting the kids express themselves.
Everybody's using this same terminology, and the kids, in my opinion, are getting that.
It's become a way that we talk at home. You know, instead of saying you need to apologize to your sister, we say to both kids, how are you going to make this right?
They know that this is a place where they will be treated fairly. And I think that's so important for kids to understand and know.
A restorative circle is a community process with a range of purpose, including community building and repairing harm.
We do circles all the time. We have advisories every day, which is like a half-hour small group of kids. And that's always a circle. We do circles as a staff every time we meet.
We do circle every morning. It's a way for me to touch bases with my kids every day. It's also another way for the kids to feel like they are spoken and they're heard. And it's, you know, it's raw. It's their true feelings. And a lot of it has actually come with the restorative practices. Rather than just saying I'm sad, they're able to explain why they're sad now.
That made me feel proud. It was accidents. When I grow up to be sisters, I play soccer and I feel strong.
How did they make you feel?
Smart.
They know that when they're willing to express themselves, the other people will be receptive to what they have to say.
Circles can be used for conflict resolution, building community, healing, problem solving, brainstorming, diffusing tension, reflecting, family issues, introducing new students, farewell to students leaving, and community violence debriefing. A restorative conference is a structured meeting with the victim, offender, and affected parties to decide as a group how the harm will be repaired by the offender.
We go to the parties, usually the students, and they both agree to it. And it's a chance for them to talk things out, to hear each other's perspectives. So we go through the questions here, the questions for the person being harmed, and the person for the questions for the person who did the harm. And usually how it works is both sides have done some harm and both sides feel harmed. And so we just go through the questions and they each get to tell their perspectives on it, and then they come up with a solution. So it's problem solving, it's real life skills for them. And they generally feel better about it in the end, and they feel like it's more fair.
Tell her what you're going to do.
Well, baby, if we're gonna be friends, then like we can't be fighting or nothing. We can't let what people say come between us. Cause most of the stuff that people say is not true. They try to start fights.
It's a pretty radical shift in a way, even though it felt subtle at first. I think it's pretty radical.
You have a paradigm shift from before, like when somebody broke a rule, then they would be punished for the breaking of the rule. A restorative approach is teaching the person who's caused the harm to look at how their actions impact not just the person that they're hurting, but also the people around them. Then a lot more learning and accountability can happen.
Recognizing that there are people that were affected by that choice, and the
effect might be something as simple as my feelings were hurt, or the effect might be so strong that another child doesn't want to go to school the next day.
What I found with restorative practices, not only does it allow a chance to build relationships, but more importantly, it creates accountability.
Restorative practices to me is taking the time to sit down and find out what is really going on, because that's the only way you're going to prevent it from happening again.
You get down to what's really going on. Lower the repeat of incidences that come up because those underlying issues are not, before were not getting addressed.
Instead of getting a referral because someone's talking back to the teacher in class, I get a referral for the reasons why the child may be talking back in class. So the student didn't get any food, the student lost their housing, the parents are separating. So we're getting at those underlying reasons, and then I can actually do the job that I was put here to do versus putting out fires.
I do our suspension stats for our school every year. For the past 7 years, I've created charts after every semester, after every school year. The discipline model, although for some cases I think, is necessary, maybe mandatory, that it doesn't fit anymore. What I realize is that we can't expel or discipline ourselves out of the problem. It's going to take real action from us as teachers and administrators and just concerned citizens to change that cycle.
The old model was very punitive. I think we just kind of took in our mind that this person's guilty, you get a punishment, and go on, and that is some vindication for the victim. In this situation, there's also vindication for the victim by hearing that the person can actually acknowledge what they did, speak about what they were thinking at the time, and also that perpetrator can hear how it made that victim feel.
The net effect has been amazing. The office used to be full of kids. We didn't have enough seats for all the kids in the office. Kids would run into the office trying to tell their stories, yelling because they wanted to be the first one to tell their version of whatever it was that happened. Now they walk in.
I just hear so much less yelling by kids, by adults, by all the staff members, by family members.
It's really important for a child's future and for their adulthood to be able to resolve conflict appropriately as a kid. And they're learning to do that at school.
And there's a feeling of calmness that we didn't have before. There's a feeling of knowing that whatever happened is going to be taken care of, that everybody's story will be heard. It allows them to handle the smaller things in a faster, more effective way, and then the more serious things get to have a little bit more attention.
It really works. It's something I've been doing for a long time, but I think with the new terminology and everybody pitching, it's helpful. Very helpful.
The guiding team folks have agreed, especially, I think we need to get to the next level. We need to have staff members practicing what we've implemented, like giving each other those effective statements. Feeling like it's a safe place to come to one another with any kinds of differences or problems that we can work out through this restorative model.
Restorative practices helps kids recognize that these feelings that they have as a result of something can be changed, and everybody can move forward. The kid who did the harm, the kid who was harmed, the teacher who might have been harmed in this process, the whole school community. I think it's really the way to go.
It's allowing our students to take control over how their days run. That no one's going to tell them what to do. You have control over how you interact with your friends and your teachers and anyone else in the school.
Well, most people really believe that education is the way our world is going to get better, and on the idea that everyone deserves the chance to be heard. Restorative practices really embodies what most teachers went into teaching to accomplish in the first place. They wanted to be part of a community of relationship that provides education. We need to reclaim the idea of relationship and education.
It works here. It's a great model here that we're using at the Civic Center, and it's working for us. So I would imagine that it could work for any school if it can work here.
It's been great for our school.
I see it working.
righty. Okay, so reactions to the video. I know that was long, but I think it was comprehensive. So reactions to what you saw. Was it a surprise? Have you seen this? Are you already seeing this in your school? Were there some things you didn't agree with? Thoughts about the video?
I think it was excellent. I mean, I loved seeing little kids learning that at such a young age, because I think that unfortunately not every time within their home lives they're, seeing restorative practices and able to communicate effectively. And I think that, when they're with their peers, it's really important to instill that in them. At the high school level, I would love to see a video like that done with students our age. So as we're implementing restorative practices, we know that they've been effective somewhere else, because I think that that's where, at least for me at the high school level, we kind of, students aren't as open with restorative practices if they haven't done that growing up. So those kids are going to be phenomenal when they get to us.
Right, exactly. And just so you know, I know there were a lot of elementary school age students in this particular video, but I feel like when I was a school principal, I was a principal in St. Louis at Metro High School, as Gilda told you, we were doing a lot of this kind of community building and talking even before I knew what it was. I didn't know it was SEL or that it was RP. It was just the way we had community at Metro High School. So I know it can be done with high schoolers. It's just, you do have to start early. And even if you're starting late at the freshman level, starting to have those conversations of this is how we do things here now. Getting the students to raise their voices and say, well, I think this should be part of the school rules. That's where you get the buy-in, and it really does happen at all levels. I know this video, like I said, showed a lot of elementary age students. Ideally, that's where you want to start, but it can happen even later if you start building that, changing that culture and climate in your high school. I promise you it can happen. Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Well, I actually was going to say, I like the fact that because through the video it did show middle school and high school. It was just mostly elementary, the classroom, but there were high school kids in there as well. I was going to say I like the fact that it appears to be effective on all levels.
Right.
Because I worked at a K through 12, so it's good to see, instead of just someone talking about it, it's good to actually see it put in practice and people to say that it works. So it makes it easier for other people to buy into it after seeing that it actually works on that level.
And I think it was important for you to see that this was in San Francisco. This wasn't some little small, wealthy school district. These practices are happening there, but they're also happening in hard, urban, everyday school districts. St. Louis Public Schools, one of the, most challenging school districts in the country. These practices are happening there as well, and in San Francisco and in Oakland. We have, at Castle, we work with 10, soon to be 19 urban districts around the country. And these practices are happening in, on the south side of Chicago, in Sacramento City, in Austin, Texas. They're doing this work, and it's working in these environments, not in just pockets of schools, but district-wide around this country. And I'm more than happy, I'll leave you my card, but I'm more than happy to have you connect and network with other teachers and principals and counselors, social workers, psychologists that can tell you firsthand, this is what we're doing, here's how it's working, here's where we made mistakes. So I'm happy to make that connection for the folks who are on the ground as opposed to folks who are like in nonprofits talking to you. But I think that's a good comment, that you want to hear from folks who are actually doing the work today, not 10 years ago. Yes. Other comments or questions or thoughts about the video? Yes, ma'am.
I think often in education, we hear about this new thing that's coming, and it turns into like, what's the program, and then how do we have to change everything, and it becomes like this huge implementation it seems friendly enough, user-friendly, where it's something that you can just shift some things. It's kind of like mindset, I guess, like, Dweck's work. It's making me think of that. It's just rephrasing some things and kind of shifting maybe the approach. But it's something that could be done at a classroom level or school-wide. The thing I think stayed with me most for that video was the notion of trust, and that although it's easy to potentially do, it seems easy to kind of shift your mind a little bit, it has to be consistent, otherwise you break that trust and then that kind of wrecks. It seemed it would break that down if not everyone's on the same page and being consistent.
Excellent point. Did you hear her in the back? Okay. Trust is critical for adults, it's critical for students. And we know that it's just like a parent, that if you're not consistent, or a teacher, if you're not consistent, if you don't have that common language, or Pamela's doing it in her class, but Jonathan is not doing it in his class, or the principal is looking at these classes, but then the assistant principal is saying whatever, do whatever you want. If you don't have consistency, if you don't have the common language to make it consistent, you heard the gentleman in here saying this is the language that we're using, and you're not consistent practice by practice or incident by incident, it isn't going to work. I can promise you that. But that's with anything. If you're not consistent, if you don't have a structure and a system in place, and if everyone's not bought into it, it's not going to work. No matter how enthusiastic some folks are, it really has to be we're all bought into this, and we have to practice this consistently. Now, is it going to happen overnight? No. Well, like anything that's worth having, it's a process, and it's going to take time. But I promise you, there are schools that I can show you that are demonstration sites that we can actually, if you have a team that wants to go out and visit an Oakland classroom, or visit Marcus Garvey Elementary School on the south side of Chicago, or Austin, Texas, or in Cleveland, or in Anchorage, Alaska. I can take you to places where the students will tell you, this is how it really has affected my life and how it's made me a better student. So. All right, so now we're going to get a chance to look at some of the effective statements. And I must admit, as a principal, as a teacher, I was doing some of these same things on the left side. Stop running down the hall. Stop teasing Sandy. Stop talking when it's inappropriate. You shouldn't do that. Sit down and be quiet. And I don't want to see you fighting anymore. Okay, so we know about these statements on the left. But look at the affective statements on the right, to make it less punitive and less, you're doing wrong. It really talks about, when you do this behavior, this is how it makes me feel, or this is how it impacts my classroom or my house. So instead of saying stop teasing Sandy, you might want to consider, it makes me uncomfortable when you're teasing Sandy. When we look back at our shared agreements, we decided as a class that we were going to be supportive of each other, not tearing each other down. So again, that shared agreement that you set as class policy or school policies at the beginning of the year, you can revert back to that to say why it's not appropriate for you to tease Sandy. Instead of saying stop talking during class, it's inappropriate, you can say I'm frustrated that you're not listening to me. I have a lot of good information that I want to share with you today. It's important information that's going to make you a better student. And I'm frustrated because I can't talk over you. You shouldn't do that. You know what? I feel really sad when you say something like that to John. Because again, when we go back and look at our shared agreements, we decided as a class that we were going to support each other. We're not going to tear each other down, and we're not going to say mean things to John. So I'm going to give you a chance to practice your own effective statements. So at your table, and you can decide who's going to be the note taker and who's going to be the person reporting out. But I want you to take a few minutes to think about maybe some of the non-effective, affective statements that you might have made as a parent or a teacher or a principal or a psychologist, a counselor. And then I want you as a table to come up with an alternative affective statement to that inappropriate statement or not so friendly statement. I'm going to give you 5 to 8 minutes or so, and decide who's going to be your person to report out, please. Thank you.
really about, and it's just wonderful. It's fascinating.
Thank you.
And it definitely, I'm a parent side of it because I'm not a teacher or an administrator, but you can really take away from it.
You can take it, you can use it in any context.
Yes,
That's true.
and I think I will.
Good. Excuse me. Okay, we'll take about 1 more minute. We'll just take about 1 more minute. Thank you. Thank you so much. All righty. There's lots of good discussions going on. And I think I heard some folks saying, yeah, I used to say this, and now I don't say this anymore. Who would like to go first? We're just going to go table by table and just one non-affective or unaffective statement, and then the in turn affective statement that you would now like to start saying. Who would like to go first? Okay. Okay, you need to get to class on time. I feel disrespected when you're late to class and we can't start on time. So it's really saying to the student, you're affecting everybody. It's not just that you're late, but it disrupts class, and that's not fair. Excellent. Like that. Yes, ma'am.
We did one, why don't you ever bring your homework?
Yeah.
You never have your homework. And another statement that you can use is, when you don't
much more effective, not affective, but also effective for the student to understand it's not just that I'm putting you down for not ever having your homework, but this is how it impacts you as a student. And I'm concerned that you're not going to be able to stay on pace. So that's a much more caring conversation as opposed to, why don't you all ever have your homework? And it also opens up a conversation of, wait a minute, maybe something's going on at home that I need to know about, and let me help you with that, because you're not staying on pace, and maybe something's going on at home that I need to help you with. So that opens up that conversation as opposed to an indictment. Excellent. Next. Yes, ma'am.
Well, we had something where when kids get involved in other kids' situations, and a teacher might say something like, worry about yourself, and maybe a better way to say it, we've got ways too.
Okay.
One would be, I appreciate you want to help, and kind of direct them that I can work on this, or I feel like right now you don't trust me to handle the situation, rather than just telling them to back off.
So you're saying basically, like, instead of saying to the student, mind your own business, it's like, I'm concerned about you. Say the two that you said again, because they were.
I appreciate you want to help, so you're acknowledging that they're trying to do something.
Right.
That perceive it to be something helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Or I feel like you don't trust me to handle the situation.
Me being the teacher? Okay, I got you. Okay, so either one would work, or both could work, actually, and saying, I really appreciate you showing empathy and compassion for your fellow student, but it's also my job to make sure as the teacher or principal that I'm cognizant or paying attention to all of the students, and I feel like you're not trusting me to handle this appropriately, as opposed to you telling Johnny to sit in his seat. Exactly. Good job. Okay. Okay, right here.
As a parent, instead of stop touching each other, it could be, it frustrates me when you guys roughhouse or when you're playing around. I'm afraid that someone will get hurt.
Yeah. Excellent job, again, of just what we're so quick to go to, our default of stop touching each other. It's just, you know what, I'm really concerned. I don't want to have to go to the emergency room tonight. So let's just be safe. Excellent job of, it really makes me fearful that someone's going to get hurt. Yep. Other examples? I knew you were going, okay.
You know what's, this goes with the teacher, stop talking in class.
Stop talking, yep.
Yeah, and just a way to rephrase that, just going off of the effective kind of restatements here. Simply telling a student, it's frustrating that you're talking while I'm trying to teach. Is there something you want to share with the class, or is there something you would like to talk about afterwards?
Okay, so be careful about that. Something about something, because that's kind of like a backhanded way to say, come on, share with the class. So I like the first part. I think you're right on with it frustrates me because I'm really trying, or your classmate is trying to share something, or I'm trying to share something. Be careful with is it something you want to share with the class, because that kind of gets back to now you're putting them on Front Street. So just, you were right along there, but this is a process, so just chop off that last part. All right, good job. Next tables. I think we've gotten all of these. Yes, ma'am.
We were saying, like, pay attention.
Yeah, pay attention.
Pay attention.
Eyes up here.
It's really frustrating when you're talking while I'm trying to teach.
Yeah. Again, to his point, it's really frustrating to me as a teacher or as a classmate that you're talking while I'm talking, and I know you wouldn't want that to happen when you're talking. So just kind of work with me. Yeah. So you can, excellent words of just letting them know I'm not trying to put you on Front Street. Yeah. Good job. Last table.
That was our example too, the whole pay attention, be quiet.
Okay, so pay attention, be quiet. This is a better way to say it. Exactly. Thank you all. I got everyone, I think, right? Yes. All right. Now, restorative practice questions. IRP, again, and I don't work for IRP, so I don't want you to think I'm in here promoting their goods or services or resources, but they really are good resources. If you Google them, if you go out to their website, and you saw them in the video, they have little lanyards with and little laminated questions on there the students walk around with, the adults walk around with, and they're basically these questions. So the questions on the left are for the offender, for the offending student. Instead of saying, why did you hit Sally? It's like, what happened? Give the student a chance to put in his or her own words, this is what I was thinking when I hit Sally, as opposed to automatically pointing the finger and being punitive. And then you can start drilling down. You can start uncovering that onion. Well, what were you thinking at the time that you hit Sally? And again, you go back to, that's not what we do here at the school. So what were you thinking? It had to be something really extreme for you to hit Sally. So what were you thinking at the time is the question you would ask. And then you would do like I'm not doing right now. You would be quiet and let the student put it in his or her own words. What have you thought about since you hit Sally? Like, how are you reflecting on the harm you caused is where you're trying to get the student to go. Who has been affected? This is kind of to a point back there about when you're late to class, it disrupts the whole school, the whole class. Who has been affected by what you've done, and in what way have they been affected? So it really helps that offender get into the shoes or into the mind of the person that was affected or harmed. And how do you think that person was affected? How do you think Sally felt when you slugged her? Okay, so it really gets that person to reflect and think about, wow, it probably didn't feel good, or it probably did disrupt the class when I came bursting in at the last minute. And what do you think you need to do to make things right? This is a critical question, because again, it helps that person think about, okay, I've caused this harm. What do I think I can do within my power? I mean, if I tore down that wall over there, I don't have the money to maybe build that wall again, but maybe I can volunteer and clean up this room, or start working and saying I'll contribute $5 a week or something to build that wall back. It really gets the person to thinking about, I've caused this harm, now it's my responsibility to make things right as much as I possibly can. And then on the flip side, it's important because I think, again, as an administrator, as a former administrator, I think we tend to think about the child that did the wrong and to punish that child. But how often are we actually bringing in the victim, the person who was harmed, to say, how are you feeling? What do you think needs to happen? So you ask these questions. What do you think? What did you think when you realized what had happened? So how did that affect you? What did you think about when Johnny hit you, Sally? And what impact has this had on you and others? It also opens up the fact that it's not just me, Sally, that was hurt, but I'm sure my mom is now concerned about my safety. I'm sure my dad is ready to go up and slug John. I mean, it kind of opens up all of the other folks who are affected by the incident. And what has been the hardest thing for you? You're gonna hear another, I think, a really impactful short video at the end, but it talks about that student and how this child was thinking about what's wrong with me that this is happening to me. Why did Johnny choose me to slug? And so it really helps that child to think about what was the hardest thing. Now I don't want to go back into that classroom. I'm embarrassed. On social media, everyone's talking about me, so I don't even want to go to school. It gets to what is the hardest thing about this particular incident. And again, one of the most important questions, what needs to happen from Johnny to make things right? What needs to happen from this school to make things right? From this classroom, from this teacher, from this parent to make things right? So it opens up not just the offender, but all of the supporting mechanisms and the context around what needs to happen to make things right. Yes, ma'am.
Can I ask what the purpose behind not asking like feeling questions is, but rather asking what were you thinking rather than how were you feeling when you?
Well, I think you can, they don't have that here, but I know in SEL and Castle, we are always talking about asking, how are you feeling? So I think that's part of the question. They may not have used that terminology, but it's completely appropriate to say, what were you thinking? How were you feeling? I think that's part of the layering of questions. That's completely appropriate. Yes, ma'am.
So I'm
Yeah.
don't know what she's talking about. So how do you even begin to utilize this with that type of situation?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think in a case like that, if there, I think you have to acknowledge, okay, if let's say that you're Johnny and you're saying I didn't do it, I would say to Johnny, well, okay, I'm going to hear what you're saying. I'm going to let him speak, and I'm going to say, well, why do you think Sally said that? And why do you think others in the classroom are saying that they saw you hit Sally? So, and if it's a situation where there are witnesses, I would pose it that way as opposed to saying, you're lying, you're going to get suspended, get out of here. And if it's not, where it's just Johnny and Sally, I would say, well, you know, I'm going to go back and I'm going to make sure that Sally has her facts correct. But she was very clear in saying that you hit her. So you think about, you know, why she would say that. I'm going to go back and verify what I think are facts. And then you just kind of, you know, go back to him and say, she's still coming back and saying it was you that hit her. And then at some point, I would bring the two together to say, how is it that, Sally, you're saying this, and Johnny, you're saying that, and try to get to it that way. And if he's still adamant, I think in that situation, I would call the parent in. I mean, hopefully you're able to kind of get to the students to come to, yes, I did, and here's what we want to do. But then I would think about calling a parent in to saying, this is really a problem because Sally is saying this, and it could be that Sally's lying. I mean, it really depends on the context, but I would try to get as much as possible without pointing the finger and getting punitive. Pay attention to both sides of the story. And that's why it's also important for the victim to explain, because it could be that she's like lying. And I really wanted, you know, for whatever reason, I'm trying to get Johnny in trouble, or so you get to both, hopefully, through these questions. Does that help? Yes, ma'am.
For those kids who, even when you saw it happen, deny it, could you say, here's what I saw happen, but I really want you to tell me in your words what happened?
I think that's an excellent idea, especially when you have witnesses, even if it's the teacher. And you don't want to, as much as possible, start enlisting other students, but when you know the full class saw it, that just adds to your argument of, Johnny, it was in the class, and a lot of people saw it, and I saw you do it. But let me hear that's exactly what should happen. You want as much as possible for the student to tell his or her side, on both sides as much as possible, and you want the adults as much as possible to facilitate the discussion, not to lead it or put words in the mouths of of either party. These are great questions. Other questions around this? Okay, and so what I was saying is that if you want at IIRP, they have those little cards, excellent little, you know, a tool that you can have in your school. And something that you brought up, Becky, that I wanted to reaffirm. A lot of these practices are things that you can do tomorrow. It doesn't cost a lot of money. You don't have to change god-awful, you know, schedules to do it. These are practices and structures and systems that you all can start doing tomorrow to change the culture and the climate in your school. So that's another thing that we like about both about SEL as well as restorative practices. Yes, ma'am.
I know that even when asking the questions with our students, and I bet with a lot of the other students, emotions typically run high. So a lot of the times, even before you can get to asking them these questions, I feel like I've had to have students like calm down, give them like 5 minutes to at least or take a walk or something before they can even answer some of these questions, because they can't even get their thoughts straight.
Yeah.
When emotions are running so high. So how do you handle that?
Excellent point, and there's something I would love for you all. I don't have a picture of it, but at Marcus Garvey Elementary School, again on the south side of Chicago, that's like a beacon SEL school in our minds at Castle. They have something called the Peace Corner, and you see this in other districts around the country. There's a little corner where they have something called the glitter bottle, and it's a simple pop bottle that they put water in and they put glitter in it. And then the students know that when they need a moment to kind of calm down, or the teacher might even say, you know what, Johnny, do you want to go to the peace corner and calm down a bit? Or Sally, you're really upset. Maybe you go to the peace corner. They shake the bottle and they pay attention to the glitter, and as the glitter settles, they're breathing. They know how to do deep breathing exercises. They're looking at the glitter. Their mind is off the incident that happened. And they're starting to do self-soothing, self-calming activities that they already know. There are puzzles back there. I mean, there are a variety of little activities that you can do to, provide back there in the Peace Corner. And it actually has Peace Corner, and they have like beanbag chairs and little, it's a real calming kind of setup. And the students know, and sometimes they don't even ask the teacher. They'll just get up and say, you know what, I need a moment. And they'll go back to the Peace Corner. And they know that in this classroom, it's okay, that the teacher's not going to say, what are you doing? Why are you going? The teacher has agreed. It's part of the community agreements that when I'm feeling stressed or when there's been an incident, both parties can maybe go back and do their own informal conferencing, or one party might go back and just say, I need a moment. So that's what I would suggest that you do. Or if you have to be more deliberate in saying, well, right now, we're not going to talk about this, but in 2 hours or an hour, we're going to come back together once we've had a chance to calm down. That's completely appropriate and suggested. Good point. So you saw in the video also they talked a lot about circles. There are so many different types of circles, but part of the reason why we love circles at Castle and at IIRP is that it creates equality. There's no principal, there's no head of schools, there's no teacher, there's no parent that's leading it. Everyone is equal in a circle. It also suggests that there's joint ownership for the success, for the process rather, that we are all agreeing that we're going to come together to try and resolve this conflict. So there's equality and joint buy-in or accountability. It also provides transparency. Now, in a circle, you can say that I'm going to pass, that I'm not ready to speak. But hopefully, everyone's voice in that circle, whether it's a circle of 3 or 4 or a full class circle of how this late person is affecting my ability to study in class. You could have a full class circle around, this is disruptive to me because whatever. So it talks about how you can provide transparency. You get to hear everyone's voice of how this behavior is affecting me. And it helps to build the connections. I've seen some circles where, and you want to, after you develop trust, I've seen some circles with students where they start talking about, you know what, my dad's in prison, and I don't know how to deal with that. Or my mom, she beat me last night, and she's never done that. I mean, you have to be very careful about the circles that you're building, but once you start building the trust in the circles, you'd be surprised, and I'm sure you all know, you've had some students tell you some pretty horrendous things. The trust piece of having that circle and having that community built in that classroom is really important before you can get to that level of discussing topics to that, that are that personal and that hurtful. So I highly recommend that if a student is in a circle and he or she brings up something that you feel like, in this classroom we don't have that trust yet, say to the student as compassionately as you can, that's really interesting, but I feel like that's a conversation that you and I need to have after we have this circle. And make sure you go right back to that student as soon as their circle is over, because it really depends on the trust level and the maturity of those students. You can build to that, and I've seen classrooms do that, but don't expect to have those kind of deep conversations or personal conversations right off the bat. So I just want to stress that. And then again, it honors the voices involved, and it also symbolizes what we know of as the circle of life and how things are cyclical just in nature. So I've seen all of these types of circles. I was in Sacramento, and I loved this circle. There was an English teacher they were middle schoolers. And this was the first time that I actually saw a circle where the teacher used it for instructional, like checking for understanding. And they were talking about a novel, and the teacher used the circle to kind of check, well, how do you think, I don't know, Catcher in the Rye. What's his name? Salinger? What's it? Holden. Right, Caulfield, right. How do you think Holden felt when this happened? And she just went around, and that let her know that, okay, I know you've read the book because you're kind of talking about different points in this novel that happened with Holden. So using circles even to check for understanding, you could do it with a math class. You could do it with anything. But it's not just always about conflict and harm or incidents. You can use it for a variety of reasons. But you can, of course, use it for understanding or repairing harm. And you saw where in the video they talked about when a student is leaving or a teacher is leaving. So you can use circles in a variety of contexts. Any questions or thoughts about, yes, ma'am? Yeah, and that kind of goes back to what I was saying about personal things that are happening in students' lives. A lot of times when I was a principal, we had something called, well, it was advisory, but we called it homeroom at the high school level. And we've had students to actually bring in situations that I don't know how to deal with this parent that's abusing me. Of course, they would come and tell me, but they needed to hear from peers. And so this particular teacher used the advisory time because they had built the trust in that advisory to talk about ways of how you can avoid the situation, or you can get additional help from the principal or from me. As you know, they use that circle to kind of brainstorm ideas of how to approach this particular problem. And I've seen it happen in other situations as well. But again, you have to make sure that you have that trust there. Yes, ma'am.
Have you heard of Circle of Courage?
I have not. Can you tell us about it, please?
Well, we're looking to implement it into our schools, and it's almost a, what was the term you used for Native Americans?
Oh, First Nations.
First Nations. And it basically, there are 4 principles: belonging, mastery. I can't remember the other 2. But I was wondering, and I'm looking at this, and I feel like this model may be easier to implement because the Circle of Courage is such a huge, it's almost a monster to try to get everybody to buy into that in our schools.
Yeah.
People are already poo-pooing it, but I feel like this may be something that they will buy in.
More amenable to.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I'll look into it. Circles of Courage.
Yeah.
I'll look into it, but again.
It's a similar concept, but on a bigger scale.
And more structured, more programmatic.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, again, these are practices. To me, I think this is good pedagogy. I think these are good instructional practices and things that good teachers are doing anyway. And it doesn't really cost a lot other than the PD, to pay teachers to get trained. But not a lot in terms of consumables or resources. That a lot of the things, if you go to the website, the IIRP website, you can download a lot of this and use it right off the bat, so less programmatic costs. This is the Restorative Practice Continuum. You heard about this in the video. Again, all the way from the informal conferencing that happens on a playground, in the cafeteria, in the classroom, to the affective statement starting on the right here, all the way to the formal conference, which is something that would happen like there's a very specific procedure that happens for a formal conference. In one of those books that's going around, they talk about formal conferencing. That typically happens for a student that, or an offender that has done something legal, the justice system is involved, and he or she might have the option of, instead of going to jail or going to juvenile detention, they agreed to doing a formal conference where they're meeting with the victim and their families and support, and they're coming up with a contract that says that I am going to do thus and so by this time, and if I don't, I know I'm going to go to jail or I'm going to go to juvenile detention. So all the way, that's the continuum, all the way from the affective statements all the way to the formal conferencing. And we're almost at the end. I'm looking at the time, but. So again, some of the strategies that will support you as you're starting this work: making sure that students understand about social and emotional learning skills, the competencies that we talked about, the definition that you saw earlier. Being very clear about the behavioral rules, the agreements that you're going to come up with collectively. including student voice in those expectations, and posting them so the students are reminded, this is what we agreed to. Obviously, you want to develop a caring and supportive climate. It's not going to work if it's not supported and it's not consistently supportive. And then, again, establishing those agreements, posting them, maintaining positive relationships. That also means adults to students, using humor whenever you can, and implementing circles. And then if you'll do those things, you'll have a fertile environment for restorative practices. Just as a reminder, I'm not going to take you through all of these, but this is called the castle wheel. This goes hand in glove with the restorative practices. So you want students to be, and adults, to be self-managed. All of those indicators are there. Impulse control, goal setting. You want students to be self-aware. That's being able to have a sense of confidence, a sense of efficacy, being able to identify and name their emotions, making responsible decisions, developing those positive relationship skills, and having social awareness, having empathy, being able to appreciate diversity, and having respect for others. Now, we say that these 5 competencies happen in these constructs or these contexts. Hopefully that you're in an environment where there's SEL, evidence-based SEL happening in an evidence-based program. And so curriculum and instruction, teaching and learning are aware of the SEL competencies, and they're integrated and aligned with your curriculum and instructional processes. And then there are practices and policies, actual district policies that support the SEL development. And then, of course, the community partnerships, why you all are here too, and in terms of community, parents, educators, practitioners, clergy coming together to understand that this needs to happen in all contexts. And so connecting SEL with RP, again, when students have strong SEL skills and competencies and are able to model them, and adults are modeling them, that's going to set up for a stronger restorative practice environment, and you'll have greater success, more bang for your buck, if you will, if you have a strong SEL environment, now coupling that with the restorative practices strategies. And there's research, by the way. There was a meta-analysis of over 213 studies that showed that when students have a strong SEL environment, there's less disruption in classes, there's less problematic behavior, whether it's discipline or depression or at-risk behaviors. There was also an 11 percentile gain on academic achievement of standardized assessments. So again, I encourage you to go to the CASEL website to see the meta-analysis of that study. It's quite fascinating to me. And now we have one last little video. It tugs at my heart, and then we're pretty much finished. So let me toggle over. Okay, I was doing so well. There we go. And I'm just going to say now that sound quality, this is from IIRP, as the other one was as well. The sound quality is not the best. There's nothing I can do about it. IIRP, it came that way from, from IIRP, not with the best quality. So I'm sorry.
In the principal's office, and I was thinking, maybe it's not such a bad old job after all. You know?
Can you hear it?
There was a knock on the door, and the father of a first-year boy asked to see me. So he came in and he told me that his son was being bullied. And I must say I was very amazed by this, because 3 weeks in the school, how come bullying is manifesting itself so early? So I said, are you sure? He said, yes. He put his hand in his pocket and he took out an envelope with photographs of his son taken at the kitchen table at home. shirt off, and he was covered in bruises all over his chest and his arms. And I was astounded, you know. I said, "Are you sure this happened at the school?" He said, "Yes, because I know who did it." He said it was a fellow student of my son's who was in the same primary school. So I said, "Well, look, I'm going to give this utmost priority, and I'll ring you this evening and have my guarantee this is not going to continue." So off we went. So I sent for the boy he named as the perpetrator of this. And as I was waiting for him to come to the office, I was thinking to myself, go back on that, I was very angry because I felt kind of personally responsible to those parents who had handed over their child's welfare and security to me, and I, as principal of the school, I let him down, obviously. So I was going to make sure this didn't happen again. So I was weighing up in my mind whether I would suspend him for 3 days, and then I thought, no, I'll suspend him for a week. Because that will send a signal to everybody in the school. Don't come into the school and bully people. So as I was waiting for him to arrive, something came into my mind. What about this restorative business? And we had little cards printed for the staff with the restorative questions on them. And I looked through the desk and I found my card with the questions. So I thought, well, look, maybe I should try these. So the boy arrived in and I welcomed him and asked him how's he getting on. And I said, well, have you any idea why I sent for you? He said, yes. I said, why? Because I've been bullying. Okay. So I looked down at my questions and I said, what happened? He began to tell me. What were you thinking at the time? He told me that. Who was being harmed by this? And he investigated the impact on the boy himself and his parents and his brothers and sisters and the other first years and the school personnel, etc., etc. But the most amazing story emerged because it appeared that when he was in the primary school some months earlier, he had been bullied himself by another student, and he had made up his mind when he came to the secondary school he was going to take on the persona of the bully. So, you know, certainly not justified behaviour, but you know, there was a certain logic to it. And then we came down to the end, you know, what do you need to do now to put things right? So immediately he said, I'm sorry for doing it. It was a very genuine apology. And I said, well, I'm going to leave you with that to think about it. So I invite you to sit outside my office then. And then I sent for the boy who had been bullied. When he came in, I asked him the questions. And one of the questions for a person who was being harmed by somebody else is, what has been the hardest thing? And the hardest thing for him was, why is he bullying me? When a couple of months ago in the primary school, we were never good friends, but he never laid a finger on me. Now every day I go in here and he's, you know, down the corridor, he's punching me, and is there something wrong with me? Suddenly I realized I have the answer to your question. And it's sitting outside the door. So I said to him, would you be willing to, if I invited in X outside the door, and we went through the questions again, and he said yes. So I did. And as we went through the questions, I began to see that the boy who had been bullied now began to realize there was nothing wrong with him. That there was a reason, twisted and all though it was, but it delivered him out of that sense of, well, I must be doing something wrong if he's turning on me. So there was a spontaneous apology given and accepted. And then I put the question again to the person who had done the harm, and I said, what could you do now to restore harmony, if you like, to this relationship? There was a very long pause, and said, and directly addressing him, he said, I'd like to invite you to have lunch with me tomorrow in the canteen. He said, I'll buy you the lunch, and that'll show the others, and I'm not bullying you anymore. So I said, how do you feel about that? He said, yeah, that's great. Okay. I said, okay, guys, away you go. And just report back to me now in a few days' time and tell me how things are going. And I will ring both your parents and tell them what's happened. And as they were heading out the door and down the corridor together, I realized that I'd just been taught a very profound lesson in conflict resolution by two 12-year-old boys. Just by staying out of the conflict and facilitating them with the proper questions and prompts and supports. So that was a eureka moment for me in my whole work as a restorative practitioner or mediator or call of it as a human being.
So reactions to that video. What did you think about that? It kind of, it's like, this is not rocket science. And I love his comment. I'm sorry, I'm just going to hopefully get back to. It just kind of shows that if sometimes adults just stand back, the students will work this out. But you have to start setting up those structures. So I love that video. So, all right, so we just know, can I get a volunteer to read this last quote? And I don't know who Ram Dass is, but I love what he said. A volunteer? Yes, ma'am.
By acting compassionately, by helping to restore justice and to encourage peace, we are acknowledging that we are all part of one another.
Yeah. And so that's basically what this work is all about. Questions, comments, thoughts of what we've talked about, and hopefully you've learned a little bit about today. Ideas like encouragement, circles of encouragement of courage. I can go back and learn. Yes, Gilda.
Yeah, is anything new in Castle? This wheel has been here for so long, and certainly it's wonderful. I wonder, anything shifting, anything, looking at where we are today?
Actually, if I go back, the 3 areas outside is new. It used to just be the wheel. And then we started having conversations. So that was the Castle Wheel since 1994. But 2 years ago is when we said, you know what, this is happening. We have to talk about the teaching and learning piece of this. It has to be intentional. And then we have to look at the policies. Like in the case of Chicago Public Schools, they started doing more restorative practices, and they started including in their district policies. No longer are they suspending students K through 2. That was a district policy. A lot of principals were up in arms, but we realized that if school districts don't start establishing practices and policies, it cannot take hold if it's just piecemeal, if it's just in pockets. So we said, okay, this has to be added to the wheel. And then we said, you know what, we can't do this without the combination of the community and community partners. So those last 3 rings have just been added in the last 2 years. But stay tuned, because we have some new resources that are coming out. We have a district handbook that's going to launch in March, April, in a couple of months. And we also have the Castle School Guide for social and emotional practices. So it's an actual guide that you can download from the website. We launched that maybe 2 years ago. So those are the latest things. Yes, ma'am.
I actually have 2 questions. So what if, when the 2 students came in, they could not come to an agreement? And second of all, are you saying that there's no consequences given for the young man's action? Or are you hoping that he will change his ways because he saw the impact of what he did to the other kid?
I think, again, and this goes to the idea around school policies. We're not encouraging folks to go against school policies. Mm-hmm. But before you get to that extreme of saying, this child needs to be suspended or expelled. Obviously, there are some situations that a child needs to be removed from the site. You're bringing a weapon to school. You're bringing drugs to school. You are causing mob action violence in the school. Yes, those students need to be removed, but before, hopefully, there were some steps before that child got to that point where you could have hopefully applied some restorative practices to get that student to be reflective and to say, this is harming my school community, and I don't want to be that person. So these are steps that hopefully will have taken place before that child gets to the point where they need to be removed from the school site. Yes, expulsions still are going to happen. Suspensions are still going to happen. But hopefully there's been some action on the front end, several opportunities for that child to be reflective and to think, here's a better choice, a better decision, and I'm not going to do that. Does it happen all the time? No, it doesn't. But we should not be finger on the trigger ready to push students out. And a lot of policies previously, as soon as the student said something disrespectful, well, you're out of here for 3 days. That kind of practice is no longer, in our opinion, no longer acceptable. So
What if they don't agree, though?
if they don't agree to the,
When they're sitting there and you agree with what's going to happen, he's like, I'm buying you lunch and I'll show, what if
the victim,
what if the victim is the person who's like, no, wait a minute, he, physically hurt me, how
Yeah.
is this okay?
you have to, as the victim, that victim has the right to say, no, that's not okay with me. And I hear your apology, but no, I don't want to have anything to do with you. That's a legitimate no. I don't want to have anything to do with you, and that's okay. It's not ideal, but it's okay. You really have to respect the wishes of the victim within reason. Now, the victim can't say, and I want you to come over and, wash my car or clean my room. It has to be within reason, and that's where the adult works as the facilitator of this is reasonable, here's what you've agreed to, and we're going to adhere to that. So the adult still has to have use some good judgment in what is agreed to, and holding those students accountable, like reminding them that this is what it was agreed to. Does that? Okay. Yes, ma'am, and then I'll get to you. Yes.
I just want to know, have you seen a lot of programs where it's actually been peer mediated?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I did that, and I feel like we didn't get to talk about that at all, but maybe you could speak to that for a little.
Yes, so again, just given the time, there's so many different structures of what restorative practices looks like. In Sacramento, as you told her, I was just in Sac City, they have a very robust, in their high schools, a peer jury and peer court, where those students, I sat in one, they are serious. They have an attorney type, a defense attorney. I mean, they actually have the students run the restorative practice piece. Again, within reason, not on extreme infractions, but on kind of day-to-day things, they let the students run it. I would encourage you to go to Sacramento Unified School Districts, and others around the country, but that's the first one that comes to mind, where they have a very robust peer-to-peer structure for restorative, for RP. I'm going to get to you, and then over there.
Yeah, I was just kind of going off what she had said. I mean, in our district, I feel like we're definitely moving, towards restorative practices and doing more of that, which is wonderful. We've seen it in action. But one of the things that sometimes happens is you get the classroom teachers then frustrated because there was no consequence.
Yeah.
So, they didn't get their lunch detention for a week. So that's where, we're struggling is,
Yeah.
getting teachers to be on board and see the important work that this is.
It is a process, and again, I don't have a magic answer of like tomorrow teachers are going to buy in. It's just like anything else. Same thing we hear about SEL. That's too touchy-feely, it's soft, it's not punitive enough. You're going to have to build the community to see and to hear from others where they're seeing this work, and hear from students of how this has really impacted my life and made me a better student. It's a process of getting folks to buy in, and the more, I used to talk about red light, green light, yellow light folks, the more green lights that you can get to start spreading the word in that school community, you start hopefully either getting folks to become yellow or getting the red lights, like, this is not the place for you. This is how we do things here, and maybe this is not the right place for you. I mean, I know that's extreme, but you start really working those green lights and yellow light folks to kind of build the buy-in. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Natural helpers? No, please tell me. I'm learning.
Well, we just started it last year. It's the idea that, and I'm in a middle school,
Uh-huh.
that there are, at the middle school level, there are kids that most kids will go to when
Ah.
they're struggling with a situation, whether it's at home, in school. And so the students actually complete a Google survey online.
Wow.
We identify those students, and then our counselors work with those students to give them problem-solving skills so that when the kids do go to those kids, that they're not saying, well, punch them in the nose, or
So they're
"I run
called
away."
natural helpers.
Yeah, so it's a, I'm under the impression it's a national program, but it sounds like it might
Fit
blend with this pretty well.
perfectly, yeah. Student ambassadors, natural helpers, really utilizing student voice as much as possible. You're not going to go wrong. You're going to get more buy-in from the students for sure when they see their peers up. And it gives them something to aspire to. You know, I want to be a natural helper or a student ambassador. So definitely I support and advocate for those kind of programs. You're right, it's hand in glove to restorative practices and SEL.
What middle school are you at?
Edison Middle School.
Edison.
Well, you all, thank you all so much. You have been so engaged.